Definitely in for a treat today with the great Rabbi Chaim Seidler-Feller, who is a faculty member at the Shalom Hartman Institute of North America. He recently celebrated 40 years working with students and faculty as the executive director of the Yitzhak Rabin Hillel Center for Jewish Life at UCLA Hillel, where he is now Director Emeritus. I had the great zchut, the great merit to work with and for Rabbi Chaim at UCLA Hillel a decade ago. And he is just a walking Torah full of heart and mind. Chaim was ordained at Yeshiva University, where he completed a master's in rabbinic literature. He's been a lecturer in the departments of sociology and Near Eastern languages and cultures at UCLA, and in the Department of Theological Studies at Loyola Marymount University. He's a faculty member of the Wexner Heritage Foundation. Rav Chaim was the founding director of the Hartman Fellowship for Hillel Professionals and a founding member of Americans for Peace Now. Chaim was a rabbinic consultant to Barbra Streisand during the making of the film Yentl. And he and his wife, Dr. Doreen Seidler-Feller, a clinical psychologist, are the parents of 2 children. Today, we're going to talk about the God of possibilities. And this is wonderful because Rav Chaim is one of the great theologians alive today. And it's a great opportunity to welcome you back. You've been no stranger. We've had you many times at VBM, and we're glad you're back.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Yeah, you can hear me. Yes. Yeah. Okay. So I want to thank Reb Shmuley and for his words, his praise, and just so that everybody understands, Reb Shmuley said that he worked with me, but he also said for me. He didn't work for me. And when Shmuley is present, not only do we work together, but he leads us. So I really want to bless this activity. It is exactly the nature of what learning should be, because Talmud Torah b'li ma'aseh, that is intellectual activity without action, is empty. It's intellectual, but the product is the change, the transformation that it brings into the world. And I think that it's a very serious question in terms of my presentation, because I feel very strongly that theology and the nature of God is something that actually has a practical impact and a translation into how we lead our lives. I hope that becomes apparent in the presentation. But first, I want to just make you aware of the fact that there is a Christian journalist whose name is, I'm forgetting his first name. His surname is Merritt, and he wrote a book about talking about God. He came from the South to New York City, and he noticed that there's an absence of any reference of people's referring to God. There's a type of embarrassment. In part, it's the product of what I see in our time, a type of intellectual war against God. Some of you are familiar with Richard Dawkins, with Christopher Hitchens, with Ben Harris, and so there's a fourth person that I used to call them the Four Horsemen, who argued against the notion of God and talked about how God is damaging. I think what that has really hurt the entire conversation. Moreover, liberal society has moved us into a secularism that imagines that liberalism without God is something that is beneficial, and that God and religion actually damage a liberal outlook. And maybe that's a question that some of you want to raise. I think that the consequence of that is emptying the playing field, and in terms of religion, allowing the extremists to promote religion and the antagonists to promote an antagonism to religion. So we need to chart a middle road, an intellectual road that embraces God. And Merritt's work raises the following question. He noted an article that did a search in the last century of words of compassion and care in public, in journalistic, in news, in the media, and in journals. And he noted a decline in the use of specific terms that have to do with caring for others, that have to do with respect for others. And there might be, I mean, we can say this, that we can actually say this. There is a correlation between a decline in talking about God and a decline in our moral concern for others. That's really important. Now, is there a causal relationship? I am unable to establish that. And do I believe that one can be moral and one can be a good person without religion? Absolutely. But I want to promote the idea that our religious tradition has as its main concern relationship, how we look at others. Remember, and we're going to come back to this, that the innovation in the creation chapter in Genesis, which doesn't appear in any other ancient literature, classical literature, is that God created human beings in the image of God. There's a sort of an automatic sense of the importance of the human being. And then in chapter 2, God, the creation of a pair of human beings, because community and concern for the other is essential in establishing this world. So the principle, if we think about it, creation was introduced into the book of Genesis in order to teach us the value of humanity and the value of relationship. And so we have to hold on to that. So that becomes the center of religious activity. And what we do then in terms of observance, we should think about it, that it leads us, it always is leading us in the direction of how to be a better human being and how to be more, and how to improve our relationships with one another and our sense of responsibility in this world. All right, that I think is important. Now, not only has there been a decline in absence in the use of God language in general society, but particularly among Jews. And I just want to make a brief comment because I really have to get to the substance. And I want you to think about this. Why are Jews so uneasy? Why is it not acceptable for instance, someone asks you, how are you? That you would say, Baruch Hashem, thank God, I'm okay. That conversation doesn't take place, or that use of terminology rarely takes place, except in certain circles. So, number one, we have a tradition that has emphasized action, just what I said before, but Torah and mitzvot, that is, study of Torah and observance, have been stressed as the distinctive qualities of Judaism. That's what distinguishes Judaism from other traditions. So Christianity went ahead and said, we're about love and they're about law, all right? So in many ways, we've internalized that in terms of emphasizing what's special about Judaism. What's special about Judaism is the code and the observance and the study. Intellectualism is sort of that which is prized in study circles, number one. Number two, our teachers, that is, in my generation, this has changed somewhat, but my generation of teachers, that is, and my generation of rabbis, had teachers who were impaired. They didn't share with their students the sense of their spiritual quest. They didn't open their hearts. They didn't share their struggles. Believe it or not, I mean, there are only few of them who shared their struggles. Rabbi Soloveitchik, Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, and think about it. They were the one, and Mordechai Kaplan, right? Those three, and of course in contemporary times, David Hartman and Rabbi Greenberg, or Yitzhak Greenberg. I mean, they opened their hearts to and exposed themselves and invited you in to talk about what it means to think about that which is beyond, and to think about the value of one's inner value, and also to think about the quest. So we didn't have a tradition of education that opened people up. There was a much more, again, this continues with my first point, there was much more emphasis on producing scholars rather than religious personalities. Right, so that has hurt us in terms of our community, in terms of the religiosity of our community. Where would you go, for instance? Would you go into a synagogue, a big synagogue, and with a sense that that's where you're going to find, or you're going to establish some spiritual relationship? Is that what's achieved? There's community is achieved. I think that's true. Now, two more points that have to do specifically with Jewish life, and one is the stress on material success in Judaism has enormous costs, and we don't talk about it, because we're successful, and I always give the example that in Barbara Streisand's film, I think it's the Mirror Has Two Faces. She says that the one that her mother taught her one Jewish thing, and that was to shop at where was it? To shop at Bergdorf Goodman on Shabbos. That was to go for the sales. In fact, the Yiddish papers used to, in the early part of the 20th century, used to carry advertisements for special Shabbos sales. So sales and purchasing of material goods replaced shul and prayer. Right? So that's number one. And number two, and that's something we struggle with, the overwhelming dominance of nationalism in terms of Jewish identity. And that has that moves us in the realm of power away from the sense of our personal relationship with God. In fact, it pushes God out. So there are elements in Jewish life that actually militate against our developing and this spiritual life. And in fact, there's been a reaction. There's a Jewish spiritual association that I think is extremely important. And more people are interested in studying Hasidut in order to enter into some work, to gain some language and gain some contact with those who think about these questions. The last point of introduction, the first time in a study session that I felt that the material that we were learning was talking about the meaning of God and prayer was when Rabbi Arthur Green taught me some Hasidic text. And I came from a Hasidic home, and no one ever told me what that's all about. Okay, in other words, my grandfather was a Hasid, you know. So that we have the sources. We need to open ourselves up to them. We need to find them. They're available and they're being translated. All right, now to the subject at hand. What I'm going to do is I'm going to share my screen. So give me a moment because I have to. I must check out for a second.
Rav Chaim, while you're doing that, is there a third factor? The two main factors I heard you say of Jews moving from God. One was this kind of materialism, being a consumer, and the second was nationalism. Was there a third main factor you shared?
No, well, okay. only what I said before that. Maybe do you have Reb Shmuley, Mata Choshe? I mean, is there another factor? No, that you think about?
I wonder if there's something about kind of a response to Christian God language that Jews want to differentiate from.
Yeah, for sure. And you know what's his name? You know, Art Green also wrote an article about the Shekhinah and the rise of Zoharic concern with the Shekhinah as a type of response to Mariology in Christianity. You know, and Shir Hashirim. You know, the material is there, and the tension. The interesting thing is to look at Judaism as presenting a variety of approaches, and to see the clash sometimes between those approaches as something that's enriching, as something that we have to grapple with. It's not something that's easily that we need to resolve. We can live understanding that there are multiple ways of approaching, and that we need to be open, and maybe they should influence one another. Maybe that's what I would say. The intellectual needs to be influenced by the spiritual, and the spiritualist by the intellectual, and action has to bring them together. All right. Now, what I want to do here is present through the eye of a number of texts. This to me was a revelation. This text. It's written by a modern Bible scholar. His name was Arnold Ehrlich. I was taken sort of intrigued by his Hebrew name, Shabtai ben Yom Tov, fine. Ibn Boded. Now, Ibn ben Boded means the lonely one, the lonely one. So he was a professor at Hebrew Union College, and he wrote a 3-volume commentary, Mikra Kipshuto, on the Tanakh, on the Bible. He also wrote a German introduction or German critical work about biblical studies, and he was interested in etymologies, not all of which are correct, but he had some wonderful ideas and insights. So let's read along here in this passage. I think you can all see it. As I said, it comes from Mikra Kipshuto, and it's a commentary to Exodus when Moses is confronted by God. at the bush, and I'm sorry, when Moses Moses appeals to God for forgiveness for the people of Israel after the golden calf, and God says, "You can only see my back." Moses' request was to see God, to know God. So this is what God responds: "Panai lo yera'u," you can't see my face, you can only see my back. So Ehrlich writes the following: "If these words have a hidden meaning, I know it not, since I have not apprehended God's secrets." In other words, Ehrlich is announcing, I'm not a mystic. I don't see this as a mystical encounter. I don't know what this means. What could it be? What I see in them is reflected in the words of a German sage who wrote, "If I was standing before God, and truth was held in God's right hand, and the search for truth in God's left, and God said, choose one of them, then I would choose the search for the truth." Now, the German sage was Lessing. He's a German philosopher whom Mendelssohn knew, and this sort of wager that he presents. I wonder if in sessions here, people who are learning can respond, because I'm interested in hearing what you might think it means. Why would he choose the search for truth rather than truth? Doesn't he want to know God? Isn't that the ultimate quest? Isn't that what we want to achieve? Wouldn't that be, the summum bonum, the height, the fine, the finale? What's wrong with pursuing that as a goal? Alex, can we open up for responses from the participants if they want to? But they may have something to tell us.
Yeah, sure. Anyone can feel free to unmute and jump in or write something in the chat.
Okay, so if we actually get an end goal of, like saying, okay, now I've got God, now I'm there, I've got the truth, everything's fine, then what's the point of, there's nothing else to do after that.
Exactly. So now, let me put it a little bit in terms of, in theological terms. If you get to the point of knowing God, you're no longer human, because no human can know God. That's sort of on that level. But what you say is so important. How do you pronounce your name?
Aglaia.
Agoya. Okay. What does that mean? What does that mean?
Oh, it's actually radiance in Greek. So.
Whoa. Okay. It's wonderful. All right. Well, you're radiating a bit, I must say. Thank you. So, but I want you, but you understand the goal of it's so interesting. We had to get out of the Garden of Eden. Humans couldn't have lived in the Garden of Eden because we cannot live as humans in perfection. We need to live in a world that requires our perfecting the world, because in the perfection of the world, we also improve ourselves. We improve what exists in that process if we see the absence as a challenge to us. So this promotes what Lessing is saying. If you had the truth, there would be no growth. There would be no human community. There would be no achievement in the world, and we would imagine at that point it's all over. I think what you said is right. Then it's all over. Why are we here? All right, let's continue. And maybe someone else. Does anybody else have something to add? Perhaps. Okay. Now, by the way, another I think consequence of our having, if we have the truth, is that we're held by that truth in such a way that there's no longer any freedom for us to choose. Right? Part of let me put it sort of crudely. Part of the excitement of life is the ability we have to choose and the challenge that we have to do the right thing. Right? That the moral dilemmas that we face constantly and the decisions that we have to make, that allows our humanity to develop. And that's exactly what that whole creation process that was presented in the Torah, what was intended to bring to us. So Ehrlich continues. A similar teaching is articulated in the Mishnah. Better one period of teshuvah and good deeds in this world than all of life in the world to come. In other words, again, better the life of imperfection in this world than all of life in the world to come, where you are. I don't know. You're sitting and in amidst the radiance with no possibility of any action that's going to push to any development in any way. You're there. When you're there, and what it introduces, by the way, this notion of achieving the olam haba is a sense of complacency. That's what you were talking about. I know, I've done it already. They taught this because one who arrives at the truth and attains eternity rests from his or her toil, since he or she has arrived at his or her destination. But one who strives towards something lofty and exalted, his or her effort is more rewarding than the reward itself. And so the goal, the purpose is the process, not getting there. And always, and what the challenge here is, and it's a difficult one, knowing that we're on the road and on this journey all the time. I think that some people want to rest, and that's also something we need to discuss. We're humans, and we can't always live with a tension of pushing forward and moving. Absolutely. But nevertheless, it's important for us to know and feel there's more to do. In other words, we need to keep that agenda alive and not push it aside and imagine that we've arrived. Right? That's, I think Ehrlich says it. And let me add, it means that we have to develop a capacity to live creatively with uncertainty. Not, because contingency is the nature of life. We just don't know. Right? So, and that means, by the way, since we can't know ultimacy, it means we'll always be searching to get to that point where we get ever closer to knowing. It means that the search for knowledge continues endlessly. I actually believe I'm a little bit prejudiced, but I think that what I've learned religiously has motivated me as a learner in the world, because I understand, since in religion the ultimate knowledge can never be attained, and we're always in pursuit of that ultimate knowledge, that's a key to understanding the pursuit of knowledge in all fields, because you can't know for sure in this world. You can only get close, approximate, and asymptotically close to that point in all fields. So this idea that someone is a master, there's always something new, that science is definite and determined and precise. There's always some correction that needs to be made. It's healthy. This is amazing, an amazing outlook. This is an educational, this understanding that we can't know everything, and the nature of carrying uncertainty with us is a key to people who value knowledge and understand, because of Ehrlich stresses that the knowledge motivates us to do, and so that we don't remain just simply self-satisfied because we're at the point where we've already made the goal itself. So Ehrlich continues, but one who is right, so too it is with regard to knowledge of God and God's ways. For if a human being attains the highest level above which there is none, what will he or she do afterwards? Therefore, no human can see God's face, and God reveals only God's back to the devout in order that they continually search and probe, drawing inferences with regard to God's face from observing God's back, and toiling all their life to know God in the most complete and clear manner. Their toil is their reward. I mean, this is a wonderful piece. I would recommend people who are interested and concerned, carry this piece with you and share it with others, right? So what can we perceive? We can't perceive God's face. That is, we can't know the truth with a capital T. We can only see God's back. That's the only thing we have is an approximation of truth. Right? That's a hard one to know. And by the way, it opens up the possibility that if we can't know the whole truth, then maybe someone else has a share of the truth, since we don't have it all. Maybe another religious tradition has a truth that actually can be beneficial to me because I don't have it all. I only see the back. I don't see the front. Someone else is looking from another angle and sees it a little bit differently. So this is where we're headed in our discussion. So what I want to say is that, let me see what time it is. I must apologize a bit. I want to, give me a second because I don't see everybody. Does anybody, is there any question at this point? Yeah, I can take a couple questions at this point. Alex, are there any questions?
I don't see any questions.
Yeah, I see a hand up from our friend Jenny Keller. Hi, Jenny.
Thank you. Now let me get back to Rabbi, the other Rabbi, Rabbi Feller. It's Jenny Keller from Phoenix, Temple High in Phoenix.
Hi,
and you and I have had the honor of studying with you many, many years at the Shalom Hartman Institute. And you just hit on something that I think about. And because Reb Shmuley has this wonderful program of learning, I'm so drawn to it. I think that my rest comes in between the learnings, and yet I'm always wanting to learn more. And then I sit back and I think, well, what do I want to learn? What is it to learn? It's the learning of myself. And if what I learn about myself is a reflection of what God is, I think that is really what you have described today that has been so moving thus far. It's amazing. So I learn, I think about it, I try and put it into action, and then I come back and I want to learn some more. It may sound very pediatric, but it just hit on something that was wonderful for me.
So what you've done is you've translated this into sort of a dynamic relationship, that the learning, right, there's a dynamism to it. It's the one thing that we have to be careful all the time is not to retreat into oneself. I mean, which I think what you're saying you don't, but that's something that you see, that would be the critique of both the intellectual tradition, because the person's all involved in themselves and their thinking and how smart they are, and the spiritual tradition, which is sometimes an escape for some people. So we want to maintain. I mean, let me say to you something that I don't think many people focus on. In the 16th century in Tzfat, there was a flourishing of mystical activity. There was the single largest gathering of Jewish scholars in history in Tzfat, and many of them, or maybe most of them, were Spanish exiles. They thought of themselves living in Tzfat in exile, right? Because they had to leave, their families had to leave. Among them, Joseph Caro, the author of the Shulchan Aruch, and of course the Ari HaKadosh and Moses Cordovero. Those are some names that you might recognize. Al-Kabetz, Shlomo Al-Kabetz, the author of Lecha Dodi, Cordovero's brother-in-law, right? They were all there. Now, what's so interesting is that community not only produced the most significant sort of mystical reflections and the most complicated, I would say, in some ways, the most advanced mystical treatises in Jewish tradition, but many of the great rabbinic sages inside of that time wrote ethical works like Mesilat Yesharim that came later in Italy, but that's an example that people will know. Reshet Chochma by Davidus, that many of you won't be familiar with this, but Cordovero himself wrote an ethical treatise, and which is extremely popular, that people study. So that what they were trying to do is to link their spiritual reflection with a life of action and a sense of responsibility to the other. And it's impossible in this world that was written about and achieved to simply retreat into oneself. I think that's really important. Now, when we talk about, what we can take away from Ehrlich and from this conversation is that the first principle is we don't know God. Now, let me add to that something about our conversation about God that I didn't say earlier, that maybe should have been articulated. What makes God, language, and God so difficult? Jewish history makes God very difficult. Right? God supposedly is caring for the Jewish people. And the Jewish people have suffered through Jewish history, most notably in the Holocaust. So there are many people who see that as the end of God. Now, that's not how I look at it, but I need to acknowledge that. And I need to also say that in our conversation and in the way Ginny formulated it, we're no longer talking about the traditional God of history and the God who intervenes through supernatural ways. We're talking about a God that we discover in our inner selves. And we're talking about a God that binds human beings one to another because we're each a part of the divine. We have an element of divinity within us. It's a much more Eastern notion of God than a Western notion that there's a being called God and I know that when you study Torah, you see that being intervening. And so what one might think that my suggestion that we're no longer talking about the God of history, which theologically rejects the notion of providence, at least the classical idea of providence, that would see this as a departure from Judaism, I must tell you that this is exactly the way the Hasidic rabbis talked about God. Now, they never denied the God of history. They just didn't talk about the God of history. They were talking about the inner dimension of divinity and the God that exists in community and the God that binds them. And so I think that's where we need, at least where I need to go, to leave behind the classical understanding and develop an understanding that we can carry with us into the future and that motivates us. And that motivates us with a sense that we need always to be pursuing more good, to better ourselves and the world around us, because we're never really there. So the first principle that I want to sort of establish, and perhaps we can use the classical language that reflects the notion of God as presented in the Torah with the name Elohim, who's sort of the judge, who's beyond that. God, that notion of God means we are not God. If I can just another sort of very short an aphorism, right? The central teaching of the Ten Commandments, in fact, maybe the first commandment, because the first line is a statement. The first commandment of the 10th commandment is Lo taseh lecha kol pesach, do not make an idol, which I translate, do not make yourself into an idol. So why God? God is the guarantor that we don't make ourselves into gods. It's so, in other words, religion is about the development of character, humility. Now, and if you look around at leaders in the world, or you look at the history of the world, and kings who ruled by divine right, and empires that established themselves as divine kingdoms in the name of God, and rulers who felt empowered to do anything they could because they had God-like attributes, we understand the danger of a society where there's no limit placed to human beings. Ehrlich starts us out by teaching us that we cannot know it all, and I'm suggesting that the first principle of the notion of God is to know that no human is God. It sounds so simple, but so essential. We even have had American presidents, without mentioning any names, who thought of themselves as invincible and infallible, or who think of themselves in that way. And it's natural, because people who pursue power fill themselves up with this sense of their greatness. And I remember a column that David Brooks wrote, in which he promoted the notion that it would really be beneficial and healthy and healing in the world if leaders would have a sense of humility, and how impressive it is to meet a leader, a world leader, who brings with them a sense of their humanity. Right? In fact, if you look in the Rambam, look at Maimonides and how he presents the notion of the king in the Torah and how he understands it, that's exactly what Maimonides says. The king has to be someone whose concern is for the people and not for himself. Right? He has to come out and he has to express that sense of concern. Now, that's why I know that often that people are rebellious in prayer, because prayers are, and especially the Psalms, are filled with praise of God. Hallelujah, hallelujah, hallelujah. So I always say, why do we need to say hallelujah so much? And now it's Hanukkah, so we're saying the Hallel every day. We don't say hallelujah because God needs it. God doesn't need our praise. We need to say hallelujah to know that we're not praising ourselves and to understand how to present ourselves. It doesn't mean we have to be, in other words, the extreme that's presented is self-abnegation. But the goal, we don't need to embrace self-abnegation. What we need to know is we're not it. We're not it, and open and make room. Because when you know that you're not it, you make room for others. When you think that you're it, then then nobody else can approach you. Right? So religion, God, the notion of God, is a guarantor of our humility and character. Once we know that we're not God and we recognize the Elohim beyond us, then we have the capacity, the potential capacity, to realize the divinity that's within us. That's really important, because if all we have is the notion that there's a divinity within us, then indeed we can set ourselves up as God. So we have to carry with us sense we are not God, but we have the potential, because we're created in God's image, to develop that godliness in the way in which and in the way in which we relate to others. This is the secret, in a way, of the name Yud Hey Vav Hey. Yud Hey Vav Hey, right, is perhaps, although there's some other scholarly opinions about the source of the name, but the popular understanding is it's a contraction of Haya Hoveh Yiyeh. It's as if Haya Hoveh Yiyeh is meaning an eternal presence. So that the notion of God, this is about presence. This is about connection. This is about relationship. This is about bringing godliness into the world and making God present through our activity, translating God into action. One of the sources, because we're not going to, I'm not going to be able to go through all the sources, but one of the sources that I bring, actually, let me move to it at this point and just show it to you so you can see it here. Let's look at this passage in the Talmud. All right. Oh no, that's not the passage that I'm looking for. I'm sorry. It's this passage. Okay. Vayavor Hashem al panav. So in the same passage in Exodus, where Moses asked God to reveal himself or to tell his name or to reveal his name, it says, "You can only see my back," and then it says God passed before him when Moses was in the cleft of the rock. Amar Rabbi Yochanan, and the Lord passed before him and proclaimed. Rabbi Yochanan said, "Were it not written in the text, it would be impossible for us to say such a thing." What's the thing? This verse teaches us that the Holy One, blessed be He, drew his robe around him like the reader of a congregation, like a chazan, right? And showed Moses the order of prayer. He said to him, "Whenever Israel sin, let them carry out this service before me, and I will forgive them." What does this mean? On Yom Kippur, think about this. What do we do on Yom Kippur? We say the 13 attributes. Adonai, Adonai, El Rachum V'Chanun, Erech Apayim V'Rav Chesed V'Emet. That's what God revealed to Moses, that God is compassionate, that God cares. And by the way, that line that we repeat, the real ending, we end with V'Nakeh, right? Which means that he cleanses and forgives. But the text in the Torah says, V'Nakeh lo Yenakeh. that he doesn't forgive everything. The rabbis purposely cut the verse in order to promote the positive attributes of the divine, not for God's sake, for our sake, that we should understand that we have to aspire to reach and to fulfill these 13 attributes. What does the Talmud mean here? The Talmud doesn't mean that that God taught Moses that if Israel sins, all they need to do is to recite the 13 attributes again and again and again, and then they get forgiveness. No, we recite it again and again and again in order to internalize it so that we act on the 13 attributes. What are the 13 attributes of God all about? It's not about God, it's about what we need to do. We need to have compassion, we need to have patience, we need to have forgiveness, right? And those are things that are so hard to achieve. Their life. This is teshuvah as a lifelong enterprise. You don't get there. That's what we don't understand. And the notion of Baal Tshuva, the master of Tshuva, is a ridiculous idea, because no one can be the master of Tshuva. Everybody is pursuing Tshuva because it's the goal of life to return. And as Ginny said earlier, it's a dual return. It's a return to godliness, and it's a return to ourselves, right? Kind of thing. Because in the process, we reveal ourselves. So by understanding the God of limitation, right, which is Elohim, we then can move on to achieve this, what I call the God of aspiration, the God that teaches us that we have to try to acquire and better the world. All right, I still have a few minutes, so let me share with you a couple of things. Number one, the secret of prayer that I learned from David Hartman. And it's related to the second dimension. We were once sitting at a retreat, and Hartman proclaimed, it's time to recite the grace after meal. It's time to bench, right? After the Shabbos meal, to recite the grace. People started singing. He said, stop. And he said, what are you saying? What's the final line of the first blessing in the grace after meals? Many of you know that. Hazanet HaKol, who feeds everyone. Someone gave the answer, and Hartman yelled at him, you're a liar. Why is he a liar? Because God doesn't feed everybody. There's lots of hunger in the world. So what could it mean? Right? Ginny got it, right? What could it mean? It means that when we describe God as the feeder of all, we don't intend it only as a description of God, we intend it as an imperative directed at us. The food is here. It's our responsibility to make sure that all people have food. That's how I approach the Amidah. The daily Amidah is a laundry list. It's an agenda of what the rabbis constructed as those goals that we should have in life: healing, justice, redemption, forgiveness. I mean, look at these values. There's more, obviously, and the rabbis understood that there would be more. But peace, it's an agenda that's enough for many lives. So we have to be careful in what we choose and to be focused and try in our lives when we pray in the morning to concentrate on what are we going to try to achieve? How are we going to try to make the world different today? What goal do we have? What among these items do we want to pursue? It's a way of reminding us of who we are and what our sense of responsibility is. So that's one thing about prayer that I think is important. Secondly, I learned this from a friend of mine, this notion. He was a colleague of mine in San Diego who had a terminal cancer. He survived, thank God. He's still writing and alive. And when he was sick in the hospital, his 5-year-old child approached him and said, Abba, where is God? So my friend had the presence of mind to say the following. He said, you see that young man who comes every week with a guitar to play for the children in the pediatric cancer ward? Because you know all those people in the congregation who are helping out in the house while I'm gone because I'm in the hospital and helping you with your homework and helping your mother, right? You know the scientists at Scripps who are working on a cure for my cancer. And he went on and on. And what he taught his son, it's magic. He taught his son, God is in the works of the people who are trying to bring healing into the world and who are making the relationship. Here, take a look, my friends. First of all, look at the drawing on the page. What is this? This is the Tetragrammaton, Yud Hey Vav Hey. But what is it? It's the figure of a human being. This is how a human being has to sort of drive themselves to embody God, so that the radiance, so God radiates from them. Remember Moses? Moses comes down the mountain with a radiating face. And that's also an important lesson. Moses encountered the divine, but the purpose of encountering the divine was to come back to earth and not to live with the divine. I mean, that's so important here, right? In other words, the goal is not to be there. And Judaism is earthly bound rather than heavenly bound. And that's a distinctive dimension of how Jews choose to seek God in the world, not by achieving unification with the divine, although some mystics attempt that, but even if they achieve that sense of unification, it's only for the purpose of then coming back and translating it into the world and into our behavior. Take a look at one more source, which I'll show you, which is so striking, almost heretical. In Isaiah, Isaiah declares, "Atem edai nu'um Hashem." You are my witnesses, said the Lord, and I am God, right? Vani Hashem. When you are my witnesses, I am God. Wow. But when you are not my witnesses, I am not God, if one may say such a thing. I mean, it's amazing, right? What are the rabbis saying? You need to be my agents. You are my representatives. When you are not carrying the image into the world, people don't know me. So it's your fault that people aren't talking about God, because you don't carry that sense of understanding and commitment and responsibility and translate. It doesn't mean, by the way, that you have to stand on the street corners and proclaim God. You have to act in a way that sanctifies, that people look at you and they say, that's a person that I would like to emulate. Now, by the way, that's true about observance. Observance is not about showing off, right? It's about leading, it's about modeling in terms of how we live, and not claiming to be too important. Now, one more text that I won't be able to read it, but I want to tell you what it is, and it's also the reason that I named the session "The God of Possibilities." I came across a Hasidic text when I was looking to see the meaning of the encounter between Moses and God, and this is earlier on in Exodus. In the and Moses. And Moses asked God, actually, no, I'm sorry, it's around the same passage, I'm sorry. And Moses asked God to tell him his name, right? So what does God answer to Moses? And usually that's translated, I am that I am. But the translation that's offered here, and I think it's in the JPS, if I'm not mistaken, is I will be what I will be. And that means that God is always growing. God is not fixed, at least the God that we're talking about. If for those who are classical believers, so there is the God that we can't touch, whom we don't know, but the God whom we can touch in our lives, that is the God that we can manifest in our lives, that God is not fixed, because human beings are always adding to that God. That was the message, in fact, the Hasidic Rebbe says, what kind of an answer did God give to Moses? Moses is to take some slaves out of Egypt. Moses says, they're going to ask me who sent me. And God tells them, tell them that Eheyasher sent you, right? I will be sent you. What does that mean? It means you were in Egypt. In Egypt, there was someone who thought he was God. In fact, he was the only one who knew God, right? His name is Pharaoh. That's idolatry, self-worship, right? Look what he did in the name of himself, in the name of the idol called Pharaoh, how he persecuted, how he abused, how he led to the destruction of his own country, how leaders of countries today think of themselves as so mighty and are willing to sacrifice people's lives for their own ego. And look at that, look at that. So God says, that was where you were. What I'm offering you is freedom, liberty, and growth, because I'm not yet. That's how I translate it. That's what the Hasidic. So the Hasidic Rebbe says the following: that he goes through, because in the answer to Moses, God says, "I'm the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob." So he asked the classical question: how come God had to repeat the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob, and not say the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob? And say, why say God 3 times? The God of, because each one of them had a different relationship with God. Each one of them carried the sense of God that they learned from their parent, but that's not sufficient. What the Hasidic Rebbe says, you can't rest on your laurels. No complacency, no claim that you know it. You don't know it. And you need to nurture the sense within yourself, that attribute within yourself that reflects that distinctive quality that's another dimension of God. And those dimensions are infinite. Right? So this becomes then a sense of growth. What my friend who writes of theology and philosophy calls what we developed in this process is a sense of epistemic modesty, because we know that we don't know yet, and that we're still learning, because other people, there are different ways of looking. We don't have it all. It's wonderful. It opens up, even though I'm sure the Hasidic Rebbe who wrote this would not agree with me, but nevertheless, what he promotes is a sense of pluralism. We need to hear other ideas, because those ideas help add to the dimension and revealing more and more godliness in the world. I know that I've exceeded my time in presentation. I want to preserve some time for questions, but I want to share one final word with you, and that's a quote from Heschel. Heschel wrote and said the following. And this is quoted in a work by Arthur Green called Hayet. From Heschel, I learned what it means to live as the image of God. His most important teaching to me, one that stays with me every day, concerns the second of the 10 Commandments. Why are we forbidden to make images of God, Heschel asked. It is not because God is beyond all images, so that no image could possibly depict God. If that were the case, Heschel argued, images would merely be harmless. Right? Because there are no images of God, so that's ridiculous. But God has an image. It's not that God doesn't have an image. God has an image, Heschel insisted, and that is you. You may not make the image of God in a thing because you are the image of God. Don't make anything. Don't give anything ultimate value. Not money, not yourself, not your possessions, not some other person that you worship. Remain, I would even say the following. This is Chaim talking, not Heschel. Be skeptical about power. Develop a sense that humans are only human, and that you don't owe your obeisance to any one human being or to any one government, for example. I'm not trying to promote rebellion. Just a sense of that there always needs to be the openness to change, to difference, to growth. Right? And to keep that avenue, that door needs to be kept open all the time. The only medium in which you can make God's image is the medium of your entire life. And that is precisely what we are commanded to do. Everything you do, everything you say, each moment and the way you use and the way you use are all part of the way you build God's image. To take anything less than a full living human being, like a canvas or a piece of marble, and call it the image of God would be to diminish God and to lessen God's image. Thank you, and let's take a few questions. We still have some time. Okay, I'm going to stop sharing my screen. Okay, and now I'll see more people. Here we are. Hello, everybody. So, any questions, please?
Yeah, I see Aglaya has her hand up.
Okay.
Okay.
Oh, and I was not muted. Okay, that's really kind of weird. Okay, I'm just going to say really quickly, because I don't want to take up too much time for other people's questions or anything though. But what you just described here was actually, in my case, the only reason why I was able to start believing in God. And it was basically I needed to have that uncertainty, or else the traditional history's God, like you were saying, the God of history was kind of bothering me a lot though, but that, that ever dynamic. And so I kind of look at it from the perspective of just a quick, fast way to say it. Maybe it's also like, there's also this idea of like the rejection of God is also a rejection of just all the bad things religion has done, and people have conflated. I don't like things that religion has done, and so I've conflated it with God is bad.
So let me say this.
Mm-hmm.
What some of us who try to talk about this, about God and about religion in general. So what we say to people is that we want you to know that we certainly, but by the way, even the rabbis 2,000 years ago didn't believe in the God that you think you were taught. That God is not the God that serious religionists imagined. that's some, I don't, it's the popular mind, the old man with a beard who in heaven who sort of has a book and controls everybody. In fact, sometimes the tradition leads us in this direction. On Yom Kippur, if we think that God is sitting there with a ledger and checking off life to this one, death to that one, and not realize that we're the ones who are writing the book, not God. In other words, and learn how to translate the language. The language itself is sometimes an obstacle because the language presents a very, crude in some ways, sometimes crude portrait of what the divine is engaged in. And I think we need to be able to open up those teachings in such a way that we realize that it's not describing a being called God, but actually talking to us about how we need to make improvement in ourselves and in the world around us. Any other questions, please? Or
Hi,
comments?
I see Erwin's got his hand up.
Okay.
Thank you. That was an inspiring and lovely talk. And it's always been my favorite part of the Torah, the part that you talked about here. But there's an additional thing that is said in there that God says, I will make all my glory, all my goodness pass before you. And I've always felt that is such an optimistic statement about the world that God created, that it's a good world. Everything you said fits in with being partaking in, doing our role as human beings in a world that can be beautiful.
Yeah. So the glory, so God's glory is this character of God that we need to adopt to. I think that I like what you say, that it's about a good world. It's not. That's absolutely. I think you're right in reading it that way. Which because after all, the creation, every day ends except one day, ki tov, right? That it was good, and on Friday it was very good, tov ma'od, right? So that becomes a challenge to us to hold on to this, because we know there's a lot of evil in the world. There is a lot of evil in the world. So if we carry the glory of God, that means the so-called sanctification of God is undermining that evil through good, right? and creating good and making goodness into a value that people pursue. Right, and see that as something worthwhile, not only success. I don't think that we stress that enough in terms of how we educate ourselves to understand what we need to do, because even though you're right that God gave this goodness in creation, it's not going to be that way unless we make it that way. We need to hold on to that, and some people unfortunately, right, fall apart in this world because they're overcome by the impossibility of actually denting the wall of hate or evil that surrounds them. And so that's a burden that people carry that needs to be somehow alleviated. It's not so easy for many people. There's a shadow that's with them. Right? How do they? And that shadow overwhelms them, so they see darkness rather than light. And how do? So we have to make sure to help people and show them models of goodness and reaching out and reaching beyond ourselves. That has an impact. That can have an impact. Was there another question? Yes, Audrey, please, Audrey.
Yes, can you hear me?
I can hear you loud and clear.
I was moved by the name of God, I am what I am, and that it can be, or also is, or can become, I will be what I will be. And I wondered if, I wrote down, as you said that, Rabbi Chaim, God is not fixed, since God grows by what we do on earth.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So first of all, in terms of the Hebrew in other words, to me, although it, because of biblical Hebrew, and I'm not efficient in biblical grammar, but because of the problem with the tenses in biblical Hebrew. But certainly it's legitimate, not only legitimate, it seems to be, at least to me, the primary meaning, that it's a futuristic a verb. Hey, yeah, I will be. Right? And I also, I think that marks a difference. It's certainly a difference in exegetical approach between Christianity and Judaism, because I looked in the Christian Bible translations, and there you see, I am that I am. God is, and there is, and we know God, right? And actually, I would say Christianity is heavenly oriented. There's other oriented, right? That's the dilemma of those who don't know God, for sure. The dilemma of those who don't know God, for sure, don't have the certainty, right? Just come with me and you'll be healed and you'll achieve eternity. We don't I'm sorry. I actually feel guilty. I can't tell Jews, be Jewish, and then that's all, and you'll, all your problems will be solved, and you'll get all the rewards because you believe. We actually don't promise eternity. Look what Ehrlich said. We promise a life of toil. So I think people have to be prepared for this, and recognize, as we heard before, is that Erwin? I assume it's Erwin. That's the name here. Who told us that in pursuing more, we bring glory. That's where the glory is. In other words, the reward is in the toil, as Ehrlich presents it. And this idea that it's a rather bold idea that we basically create God, right? We make godly, through our godliness, we increase the presence of God in the world.
I always think God created the world for this opportunity, God.
Correct.
And so that's why I will be what I will be based on what you guys do, And
Excellent. So my last word. I know that we've reached time. If it's possible, I encourage people, if they're interested, look into some of the Hasidic writing. Arthur Green just translated a major volume. It's published by Stanford University Press. It's called the Ma'orei Naim, the Light of the Eyes. It's the work of the Hasidic rabbi of Chernobyl. He was in the third generation. He he received direct teachings through the Maggid of Mezrich from the Baal Shem Tov, and a Green, you should know, gives some public classes, he's finishing up now a series where he's teaching weekly. He's going to start up again in the spring. He's retired from the Hebrew College, so he has time, and he's teaching people and the public. And I actually participate there. In one class there were 100 people. This class there were about 60 people, but it's open to the public, and it opens up this type of literature, because you do need a key to reading the Hasidic literature. You need to have sort of the basic language in order to get through those texts. But it's extremely worthwhile. There's a little book that he published many years ago called "Your Word is Fire." They're Hasidic aphorisms on prayer, and it's marvelous with little commentary. So I can refer. I can give you some more suggestions, but I think that there's more to be said on this issue, and there are people who teach like this, and what's so rewarding, and what I really appreciate is that the teachers of spirituality in Judaism are also the doers of social justice, right? That they've made that translation, and they're not inviting you into a world of separation. They were inviting you into a world of engagement, and that, to me, one of the redemptive features of Hasidism, which has a lot of problems in terms of the Rebbe and how the Rebbe is lionized, and I would say almost deified, right? I mean, it's a real problem. But that Rebbe is the anchor who actually brings the community together. That's the focus. The person, if he is a Hasidic Rebbe who's actually attempting to achieve his fulfillment, the fulfillment is gained by being the conscience and the caring and the one who cares for his community, so that the community understands that they're all bound together through him. That's the spiritual connection that's being made. So it's not right. So that's very important, and we desperately need more opportunities for community. Sometimes community can be achieved through learning. Sometimes community can be achieved through being involved in social justice projects. And how wonderful it is if my community of learning is also my community of action. I mean, that's what I think some people have tried to achieve, and we should encourage that. Thank you very much. I hope to see you again, and happy Hanukkah. And remember, I mean, I'm sure you've heard a lot about the light of Hanukkah. All right, but see something which is really striking. Why did the rabbis develop this notion or this story about the oil? Right? It was a conscious decision that they made to de-emphasize the military, the military victory, and place the emphasis on the spiritual. Right? And we see, and you know, what do? We do the opposite. We march. We are the Maccabees, you know, and if you read some modern Israeli poetry about, you know, fighting against and so on, so you see that we took the wrong lesson. You know, this is what I'm saying. You know, the rabbis get mistreated, and people think of religion in one way, and look at what's going on consciously. The rabbis did this consciously. They underplayed.
What do you think, Rabbi Chaim, though, of extending it to Zelensky? Like, do you think the underdog being pushed by Putin, is that a good militaristic connection?
But I would say that if you must engage in a military pursuit, then you need to know that the goal is not victory. The goal is peace. Or as Zelensky says, the goal is democracy. In other words, it's values driven. It's not about me. What value is there to beat up someone? All you do is promote more resentment. Right? Now, there are some enemies that you have in this world that have to be beaten up. I mean, unfortunately, because at least their presentation is so evil, and their ultimate goals are such. So it's unfortunate, and as much as I've talked about, you know, the idea of self-limitation on one hand, and then self-affirmation on the other hand, in the notion of God, we need to really be careful and understand that despite our disgust with military activity, there is sometimes the necessity, certainly, to defend oneself. To defend oneself I'm not a pacifist in that regard, even though I want to read the sources as promoting the value, all right, that value of inner peace and communal union. Okay, enough. But Hanukkah is a great lesson, and I would also, if you look, one more thing I want to share with you. If you look at Maimonides in the Mishnah Torah, okay, it's interesting. He decides to conclude his whole presentation about Hanukkah with Gadol HaShalom, greatest peace. See the last paragraph, as he sums up the story of Hanukkah and tells you what Hanukkah is all about, right? He ends with the fact that the Torah is all about peace. Why is he doing that? Because he knew how to read the Gemara right. He understood that the Gemara was teaching us. And by the way, something else that we need to know. Maybe it was it was a mistake to rebel against the Romans. Who in their right mind rebels against the Romans? Now, Hanukkah, that was when the temple was destroyed. They succeeded in Hanukkah. Okay, every once in a while, a rebellion succeeds, but don't count on it. That's what happened. They concluded, we beat up the Greeks. Now we'll get the Romans. we beat up the Greeks because the Greeks were themselves in disarray. They were in disarray, and they couldn't bring the forces that could deal with a rebel group who actually fought against some elephants, I think, and they were in a conflict within the Greek camp. Right? So we were fortunate, but the rabbis say don't celebrate, don't make your focus on the fortunate achievement of the victim. Understand that eternity is achieved through light, not through might. Okay. Chanukah Sameach l'kolchem. Take care, all of you. We'll see you again soon. Shalom, shalom.
Rabbi Chaim, thank you so much for joining us today and for leading us in our learning. And thank you all for being here as well. I just want to let you know about our next program coming up next Thursday on December 29th at 1 p.m. Mountain Time. We'll be hearing from Dr. Malka Simkovich on Letters from Hanukkah's and Purim's Past, the Establishment of Minor Holidays, and Judeo-Diaspora Relations. So hope you can join us for that. Happy Hanukkah, everyone, and thanks again for being here.